For today's fall painting, I'll be using gray titanium, Venetian red, burnt sienna, undersea green, perline green, and crystal silver. Crystal silver is a metallic watercolor from CSY Art Gallery. I just love this little tin, and I'm going to link my playlist for other projects using these metallics. The brush I'm using is a size 1 angle brush. So as you can see, I've used my pencil to sketch a variety of simple fall items, a pumpkin, 2 acorns, and some floral elements. And I'm not going to wet my whole page, but just the pumpkin for now. I'll be doing my best to work around the objects in the front, but you could certainly use a liquid resist if you like. And if you're not familiar with liquid resist, it's basically just a fluid that you can paint onto any areas that you want to keep untouched. It acts as a mask while you paint. And then once dry, the resist can be rubbed away. I'll include a link below in the description if you'd like to get more info on it, and I'll have my supplies linked there as well. Now that I have a decent amount of water down, I'm going to begin with a layer of crystal silver metallic watercolor. And just so you're aware, we have some construction going on next door to our house, so there's a constant just rumbling and shaking that unfortunately just can't be avoided, so I hope it's not too bad in the video. There are a number of different ways to use this particular paint. The first option is using it as a base layer like I'm doing now. You can also add the crystal silver into each of your color mixes. I don't normally do this because I feel like it's just creating a lot more work for myself if I don't prepare enough of each batch the first time around. And then the third option is to layer the crystal silver over your painting at the end. And if you're going for maximum shimmer and shine, then you might like this last option best. But I'm usually going for a more subtle look, and I find that adding metallic last can take away from some of the details that I've already laid down. So this is my preferred approach, putting down the base layer first. For my pumpkin, I'm using a blend of Venetian red and burnt sienna. The result is almost a salmon, which I really like. And if you have these two paint colors, I'd encourage you to play around with different ratios of each paint. Do you prefer more red or more orange? Do you like deep dark shades or soft and muted? You can wind up with some really beautiful colors. I'll be using a number of different mixes for my pumpkin, but each time I'll be using only these two paints. As I move on to the other areas, like the stem, I'm once again starting with a very wet brush, laying the water down first, followed by the crystal silver, and then finally the paint. And now I'm using undersea green. I know it's difficult to see the shimmer on camera, but once we're further along, I'll move the page around a bit so you can see the shine. I was originally planning on using a fine pointed round for some of the smaller details, but this angle brush is so versatile that I don't think it's going to be necessary to switch brushes at all. Instead, I'm tilting my brush so that only the tip is touching the paper when I do need those fine details. And as long as you aren't going for super precise, I find that the angle brush is suitable. In fact, this is probably the brush I use most out of my whole collection. For that sprig of wheat at the bottom, I was using gray titanium over crystal silver. Is that the correct term? A sprig of wheat? A clipping of wheat, maybe? Well, I'm not sure, but you get the picture. And up here, we're going to use more gray titanium. And I'm going to mix it with a little bit of undersea green. The goal of this first wash is to get the lightest values in place, so don't worry if your painting is lacking in depth and contrast at this stage. The ugly stage is something we all have to deal with, right? There is almost always that point in the painting when you're doubting yourself and wondering whether or not it's going to come together. I'd say the ugly stage is even more prevalent with full wet on wet paintings, not as much when I'm working by section. And for me, the doubts will usually creep in towards the end of the first wash. But if all goes well, I'm starting to regain some confidence as I approach the end of my second wash. So we'll just have to see, will I conquer the ugly stage today? The only way to know is to keep moving forward. As I work on these acorns, you'll see that at this point the colors aren't exactly in the realm of brown like you'd expect from an acorn. But I think it's things like this that can really make a painting more interesting. Instead of reaching for a basic brown, I'm going to play with my mixes and glazes, sticking to only this very limited color palette, and hoping to land on a finished look that resembles brown without being too obvious. I've been challenging myself to do this more often. In the past, I would almost always reach for the straightforward answer, only varying slightly to account for highlights and shadows. But with this new approach, this is something I'm going to be actively working on since I've been happy with the results so far. I'm not quite to the point of taking on a whole painting in this manner, but I'll get there eventually. We've all seen those videos about using complementary colors for shadows or underpainting, right? The artist will sketch a lemon and first reach for a blue or a purple instead of the yellow that we're expecting. I suppose what I'm doing with this acorns is kind of similar, but maybe with less of a plan behind my actions. And I can see in my mind what I'm going for, but a lot of it still just comes down to trial and error. The first layer of paint is dry, and I'm going in now with a more saturated mix of Venetian red and burnt sienna. Imagining that my light source is sort of behind and slightly above the pumpkin, I'm sweeping my brush downward and working around those acorns. I may have gone a little bit too dark on the top there, but that's okay. And see how I'm going over the top with a damp brush to soften the edges and smooth out that second layer? If you want to do it like this, just make sure your brush is clean and damp, but not too wet, or you'll wind up with blooms. After adding more color, I follow with the damp brush and smooth. And of course, I do want to make sure that I hit those spots that are meant to be darker, like the grooves and the bottom, because these areas wouldn't receive much light. For the second layer on the acorns, I'm using burnt sienna with gray titanium for the body of the acorn, and undersea green with gray titanium for the caps. See how we're getting closer to a brown? And for this cross hatching that I'm going to add, I've mixed in a touch of burnt sienna as well. I'm using this same blend in a few other places. I'll be using it on the tops of those pods, as well as a second layer of the wheat. I really like to make sure that my colors are repeated in little bursts throughout the whole painting. I'm rotating my brush again and making these small wispy movements with the tip of my angle brush. I often need to remind myself to refrain from covering the entire painting with a second layer of paint. It's so important to leave some of that first layer light, otherwise we lose the contrast and the variation in values. Okay, so this is how it's looking after 2 layers. We have the majority of our light and mid-tone values in place. And we'll take a look at that shimmer and shine. Unfortunately, I didn't realize that my battery had died, and I did not capture the third layer with my darkest values. So I'm just going to do my best to let you know what you missed. The pumpkins, flowers, and acorns received an extra touch of paint, just more saturated than the second layer. And if you take a look at the greens, the pods, stem, and leaves, you'll see where I brought in a mix of undersea green and perling green in order to get those dark shadows. So this is a nice soft look, and you can certainly stop right here, but I'm going to grab a brown fine liner and show you what it looks like to add outlines, as well as some dots and dashes for extra interest. I went with brown because I felt like black would be too harsh for the current color palette. So, what do you think? It's a totally different look, and it really just depends on personal preference. Let me know in the comments, do you like the fall painting better with the ink details or without? Well, thank you so much for watching.